Available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello everyone and welcome to the second to last segment of today's show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far. I know I have. Keep up your interaction. It has been a great part of today's show. But coming up next, our fourth segment of today's show, shifting gears from an overarching grab bag of fantasy topics to my final QB ranking. Not my personal final QB rankings, but some comprehensive QB rankings to give you guys before week 2. Now, I will give my personal rankings coming up later in the week, but these are the guys who certain pundits have assessed and said had the top 5 performances or potentially will have the top 5 performances in week 2. So without further ado, let's jump right into this second segment of today's show. Now, the QBs this weekend were very telling, but at the end of the day, I feel like this top 5 is kind of chalk. It's not necessarily an ambitious top 5 in terms of, say, whether or not you're in a deeper league, but these are the top 5 guys, and this is what I expected to wake up to in terms of trying to decipher who different pundits thought the top 5 fantasy QBs were. So without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit more in depth. At number 5, we have, of course, a guy who could kind of a rough game, depending on whether or not you believe that he should have been that involved late in the game, and they should have stuck with the run game like I was talking to and alluding to in my fantasy predictions segment. But Lamar Jackson. Oh wait, is this the right one? Oh, I guess I only had the top 4, but Lamar Jackson was my 5th one. He has 26 for 41 this week, 273 yards, 1 TD, 25.12 points. Before we get into Jared Goff, just wanted to talk about Lamar Jackson a little bit, give him some love, and I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic for Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry in that backfield. I think that out of necessity, they allow Lamar to try and get back into this game by throwing the ball more. But it will change week by week. And against the Raiders this week, I feel like there might be opportunities for Derrick Henry. But at the end of the day, that front is really going to make the difference. Can the Raiders' defensive front keep him in that game? And so Lamar Jackson will have to perform out of structure. It's going to literally be up to him to perform out of structure. And so I really think that Lamar Jackson could have been higher on this list in terms of pundits' minds, but he is going to be someone who is still highly coveted as a top-tier fantasy QB. But as you can see on my screen, prematurely getting ahead of myself here, but number 4 is, in fact, Jared Goff. He had only 11.38 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Rams. Didn't really have a big game, really allowed the running backs to dictate this game, but I can see why a lot of people are still so high on him. Maybe this is kind of an over-exaggeration from pundits, but he is someone who I still think is believably going to be at least very reliable fantasy QB. He's not going to have the prettiest of numbers. He's not going to be, in that Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, Jackson region, but he's going to be someone who could find himself in weekly top 5s in people's minds. And so I think against the Bucs, it's going to be a divisional game matchup, much like the Rams one was. And so I feel as if this game is going to bring out the best in Jared Goff. I definitely don't think that he will, kind of take a backseat this game. He's going to take the initiative. He wants to get Amon-Ra going. He wants to get Sam Laporta going. He wants to get all those versatile weapons going in this offense. And so look for Jared Goff to have a quote-unquote bounce-back game, even though he wasn't necessarily the worst player. Now, the third one makes a lot of sense, and perhaps he was my top fantasy QB player this week. Josh Allen, 31.18 fantasy points against Arizona, included 232 yards passing on 18 of 25, 2 touchdowns, 39 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground as well. Obviously, kind of nursing that hand/wrist injury, was cleared to play against the Dolphins Thursday night. So excited to see that matchup, but this was a very impressive performance. Yes, he did fumble in that first possession, but he put his head down, and even though they had many struggles in their first half against Arizona, in the second half, he was sterling. He really impressed in this game, and it could have been that he was the number one player in terms of fantasy overall and as a QB because of his do-it-all abilities. I'm kind of shocked that people don't necessarily believe the hype surrounding Josh Allen, but I believe that Josh Allen doesn't get his flowers for what he's done. He's navigated a lot of tense situations in Buffalo, and this year certainly feels like a weight has been lifted off his shoulders. He's a rejuvenated man in an offense that's tailor-made to play to some of his strengths and also kind of hide some of his weaknesses as well. And in this game, as Andre says, agreed. Thank you, Andre, for that comment. Welcome to the show if you are new here. Continue commenting if you so like. But getting back to Josh Allen, I still think this guy is going to be someone that's always, at the end of the day, going to be in the conversation as a top 3, top 1 maybe, fantasy QB as the weeks go by. So I'm not worried about Josh Allen. He deserves to be in these rankings. He's my favorite QB in the league for sure, says Andre. He's definitely in mine. I'm kind of biased about my QB likes because a lot of people might not like my favorite QBs, but he's definitely someone who I've loved for many years because of his dual threat ability, and this year certainly feels like it feels different for him in terms of how he's performing and how he can perform in future weeks. But going to number 2 on this list, Jalen Hurts. Let's talk about his performance. Now, this was a weird game in general. International game. A lot of big plays, but a lot of bad moments for both offenses. And Jalen Hurts wasn't necessarily out of the clear here as well. He had some big plays. A.J. Brown was fantastic. Saquon Barkley had a passing touchdown. Kudos to him for getting involved in the pass game. He was one of the fantasy standouts of the week for me as well. But at the end of the day, Jalen Hurts definitely felt like he left a lot of big plays on the field. I don't know if it's kind of like the international kind of mindset where you're not necessarily in the confines of your home or what have you, but it certainly felt like even though he had a good fantasy performance, he had 16.42 fantasy performances in this game, I still think that he could have a lot to be desired. And this offense could look a lot of different ways week by week. I think that Kellen Moore is just learning the strengths and weaknesses of what this offense can do. Obviously, the retirement of Jason Kelce is a big thing. I think that Cam Jurgens held up admirably in certain situations. But this is an offense that I still feel is going to have growing pains as Kellen Moore tries to implement new ideas into it. And Jalen Hurts, I still think is going to be in the top 5. As Andre says, what do you think the red zone split percentage will be with Hurts and Saquon? Another fantastic question. Or do you think they just continue to feed Saquon in the red zone? We got a very similar question, Andre, a couple weeks ago about how they will utilize Hurts and Saquon in the running game. In terms of answering this particular question, I think that Saquon just adds a lot of value anywhere on the field. I think that he will take a lot of pressure off of Jalen Hurts in terms of, Jalen Hurts just running to create opportunities down the field. But at the end of the day, in the red zone, I still think Jalen Hurts has a lot of value because there will be a lot of opportunities for the tush push to happen. And Saquon doesn't necessarily profile into that picture. But in this game, Saquon did have a lot of red zone touches. So it's something to monitor. I think that a lot of it will come down to how drives work out and pan out in the future for the Eagles. I think that Saquon can make a lot of plays happen in the open field in terms of explosiveness, and Hurts just makes kind of calculated plays in terms of what he sees down the field. So That being said, I think it will come down to like how drives pan out, because sometimes they have those weird drives where they'll end up at the 1 yard line and the tush push is the way to go. Or sometimes they have drives where they might need, Hurts to improvise a little bit more. So it's going to be an interesting situation, but fascinating question. Thank you for it, Andre, and thank you for your comments throughout the show. But like I said, Jalen Hurts is going to be a quarterback who's going to be in these rankings very often, but he's someone who's going to have to prove week in, week out that he can lure Kellen Moore's offense to the best effect and have it pay dividends on the field. As Andre says, I hope this will utilize the tush push at the goal line. Hurts is my QB in fantasy. Need that. Always looking for different ways to elevate your fantasy points. Love it. I think that the tush push will still be a big part of this offense. It's not going anywhere. Thank you for your comments, Andre. Fantastic comments, as always. Keep them coming if you so wish. But our final QB on this list, always going to be here and hereabouts, Patrick Mahomes. It wasn't his best game. Only 15.14 fantasy points against Baltimore. I think that this is just indicative of who Patrick Mahomes is. This is nothing to do with, the weapons he has, but the way Patrick Mahomes can and will utilize these weapons. Because we saw, it was a very mundane game from him. He had the pass to Xavier Worthy. He had a couple good passes. He utilized Rashee Rice very well. But you could say a lot of QBs performed quote-unquote better than him, especially in fantasy purposes. Like I said, though, week by week, Patrick Mahomes, as this wide receiver room gets more depth to it, as this wide receiver room gets Hollywood Brown incorporated into it, it's going to continue to be dangerous. And the Bengals are going to be no different, especially how they looked. Consider the stats against the Bengals as well. 112.5 passer rating, 1,085 yards, 8 touchdowns, only 1 interception in his career against the Bengals. Doesn't have the best of records, only 500 against them. But it just goes to show that Patrick Mahomes doesn't necessarily fear certain situations. As funny as it was to say what the frustrations that he seemed to have last year with the drops from his wide receivers, this year the whole narrative seems to be shifting. And a lot of people, might not, quote-unquote, like Mahomes in real life or in fantasy because they just feel like there's so much depth at the QB position now and want to go a different route. But Patrick Mahomes is always someone who's going to be on this list. Like it or not. Make of it what you will. And I really think that what impresses me about the Chiefs is that no matter who they rotate in and out, Patrick Mahomes will always find a way to make a big play. One of my favorite plays was not, one of my passes to one of the guys expected. It was a pass to Justin Watson, because it just goes to show that you have to account for so many different receivers and weapons in the system that you can leave a guy open in the middle of the field. And that's what the Chiefs can do. That's what Patrick Mahomes can do. Let me know what you think about this list in the comments. Again, this is not my list, but it is pretty comprehensive, and it's basically chalk from this week. These are 5 guys, maybe excluding Jared Goff, you expect to be here and hereabouts almost every given week in terms of who releases what. My personal top 5 will be coming later in the week, more so in terms of matchups instead of, overall QB rankings. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Thank you for the comments during it. But our last segment of the day will be looking at the running backs in terms of their rankings and what pundits think of them. We'll be right back to finish the show after this quick break.